Look at subtracting decimals. Yesterday you should have successfully completed the unit on addition with decimals. So today we'll move on to subtraction. And we have done column subtraction before, but we'll be using a new strategy today. Previously we have worked right to left, following an Arabic way of working, whereas today we're going to go from left to right, which is more intuitive for native English speakers. For this to work, we need to know our place value columns. And just remember that if we have 1 in the left-hand column, so for example 110, it is worth 10 in the right-hand column. So 110 is worth 10 ones. Similarly, if we have 10 in the right-hand column, it is worth 1 in the column to the left. We know that this applies across the place value columns, even into our decimals. So we have our ones, our decimal point, our tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So if I have 1, 1, if I look to my right-hand column, which would be my tenths, it would be 1, 1 would be worth 10 tenths. And we know 10 tenths is worth 1, 1. Similarly, we have 1 tenth in the left-hand column, which is worth 10 hundredths. Or 10 hundredths is worth 1 tenth. Now, how we're going to use this in our subtraction sums is as follows. So 3.56 take away 1.32. And today I want us to think of subtraction as the difference. So the difference between these two numbers. And when the first number, when all the digits are larger than our second number, it's quite easy. So we have 3 wholes, 5 tenths, and 6 hundredths. And we want to find the difference between 1 whole, 3 tenths, and 2 hundredths. So in our ones column, the difference is 2. We've got to remember our decimal point, and prior to this we've got to make sure we line everything up properly, because otherwise our sum will not work. In the tenths column, the difference between our 5 tenths and our 3 tenths is 2 tenths, and in our hundredths, the difference between our 6 hundredths and 2 hundredths is 4. So it's quite easy when the top number, 3.56 in this case, is larger, every digit is larger than the bottom number. Finding the difference is very simple, and we should actually be able to do it in our heads. So here we should, if you want to just have a go at these quickly, you should just be able to work all of these out from the differences. So the first one, the difference between 5 and 0, the difference between 2 and 1, the difference between 1 and 0, the difference between 6 and 4, remember your decimal point, the difference between 4 and 2, the difference between 3 and 2. You should just be able to do that left to right. Secondly, the difference between 3 and 0 in question 2, 9 and 3, 5 and 4, 2 and 1, put your decimal point in, 7 and 5, 5 and 0. Done. And lastly, in 3, you've got 5 and 0, the difference, 9 and 2, 3 and 2, decimal point, 4 and 3, 6 and 4, 9 and 0. Those ones you should all be able to do quite easily because the number on the top, every digit is larger than the number on the bottom. However, some difficulties arise when some of the digits on the top are actually smaller than the digits on the bottom number. So here we have 2.06, so 2 wholes and 6 hundredths. Take away 1 whole, 3 tenths and 2 hundredths. So representing this visually, we've got 2 wholes and 6 hundredths. And we need to find the difference between 1 whole, 3 tenths and 2 hundredths. Now you should be able to see that your problem arises in the tenths column, because this is the column where the top digit is smaller than the bottom digit. So I have 0 tenths in the top column, whereas I have 3 tenths in the bottom column. So here I have to exchange across my place value. So I identify where my problem is. Here it's in the tenths column, and I exchange from the column to the left. So I exchange one of my ones for 10 tenths, because 1 1 is worth 10 tenths. So now I have 1 1, 10 tenths, 6 hundredths on the top, and 1 1, 3 tenths, and 2 hundredths on the bottom. And then I just do it as I did before. So the difference between 1 and 1, 0. The difference between 10 and 3, 7. And the difference between 6 and 2, 4. Make sure you line up your place value columns with your decimal points, and that your decimal point is in line with your answer. So my answer here would be 0.74, or 7 tenths and 4 hundredths, or 74 hundredths. So I'll show you that one again. The only time we might have a problem is when digits on the top are smaller than the digits on the bottom. So here I've got 4.51, take away 2.35. So I'll represent this 4 decimal point, 5 tenths, and 1 hundredth. And I need to find the difference with 2 wholes, decimal point, 3 tenths, and 5 hundredths. So the problem, hopefully you can see, is in the hundredths column, because that is the only column where the top number is smaller than the bottom. So you can see I've got 1 hundredth at the top, whereas I've got 5 hundredths at the bottom. So that column I'll have to look to exchange in. So when I'm exchanging, I look to the column to the left. So I'm going to take 1 tenth and exchange it for 10 hundredths. So I take one of my tenths and I exchange it for 10 hundredths. So now I still have my 4 ones, but instead of 5 tenths, I have 4 tenths. And instead of 1 hundredth, I have 11 hundredths. And then I can work left to right, remembering my decimal point. And the difference here between 4 and 2 is 2. Put my decimal point in. The difference between 4 and 3 is 1. And the difference between 11 and 5 is 6. I hope that makes sense. Now that was it represented visually with counters, which you can draw out if you would really like to, but we should be moving on to just doing it in written form. So here is the same strategy, but in written form. So I have 13.49, take away 1.75. So I've laid it out properly, lining up my decimal points, and then I can just go from left to right. So the problem column here is my tenths column, because 4 is less than 7. So that is where I have to exchange. So I look to the ones column, and it's important that we don't call it borrowing, because we don't give it back, we call it exchanging. So I am going to exchange one of the ones for 10 tenths. So instead of having 3 ones, I'm going to have 2 ones. And instead of having 4 tenths, I'm going to have 14 tenths. And then it's all okay, so I can work left to right. So 1, the difference between 1 and 0 is 1. The difference between 2 and 1 is 1. Put my decimal point in. The difference between 14 and 7 is 7. And the difference between 9 and 5 is 4. So my answer would be 11.47. Same again, just trying to get you familiar with it. I must line my decimal points up before I even start. So I've got 7.827 take away or 3.55. And we're really trying to think of the difference between. I'm going to put a 0 in my thousandths column. Sometimes that's easier. You could leave it blank if you wanted to, it's up to you. Now, if we look, my problem column is my hundredths column because I've got a smaller number at the top than the bottom. 2 is less than 5. So I look to my left-hand column to exchange. So I'm going to take 1 tenth and exchange it for 10 hundredths. So instead of having 8 tenths, I have 7 tenths. And instead of having 2 hundredths, I have 12 hundredths. Everything else is okay, so I can work away. The difference between 7 and 3 is 4. Put my decimal point in. The difference between 7 and 5 is 2. The difference between 12 and 5 is 7. And the difference between 7 and 0 is 7. So my answer is 4.277. Now sorry. There we go. Now you can have a go at this question. You should only have to exchange once. So line up your decimal points, write out the sum, and exchange. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. Now, this strategy should be used when you only have to exchange once. Sometimes you'll have to exchange more than once, and in that case, this might not be the most effective strategy to use. And maths, as we get older and more proficient, should be about choosing the best strategy for the question that's in front of us. So this strategy is the best strategy when we only have to exchange once. We're just going to look at a question where we would probably have to exchange more than once, and in this case, we have to use a different strategy. So subtract £24.99 from £540.50. Here, you shouldn't be using a written subtraction. Even though you could, you should be doing this mentally. And if for the whole of today we've been looking at subtraction as the difference between. Sorry. So if I had 12 take away 5, the difference is 7. If I added 1 to each side, so if I added 1 to the 12 and 1 to the 6, the difference is still 7. If I added 2 to each side, so the 12 becomes 14 and the 5 becomes 7, the difference is still 7. Similarly, if you took away 1 from each side, so the 12 became 11 and the 5 became 4, the difference would still be 7.